Now, Stuttgart are the second biggest team in the south of Germany, and after a brief period of struggle, in 2024 they finished second, and under head coach Sebastian Hoeneß they have the real capability to add to their 3 Bundesliga titles. But how did they win those titles? And each one of them was far from easy and was filled with plenty of drama. So Stuttgart, as we know it today, was founded in 1912 following a merger between 2 Stuttgart-based sites. One in the area of Bad Cannstatt, which is, if you're looking at the map of Stuttgart, it's on the one side of the river, the Neckar, and another team from Stuttgart itself. The 50s were their first major period of success. They won the national championship twice in 1950 and 1952. While they also would win the DFB Pokal in 1954 and 1958. They were one of the founding members of the Bundesliga, but never really challenged at the top of the table and ultimately float around mid-table before being relegated in 1975. And this prompted major change. So during the relegation season, Gerhard Meyer-Wohlfelder would be elected as the club president. Meyer-Wohlfelder was a local politician. He held a seat in the local Baden-Württemberg cabinet, both before and during his time at Stuttgart, and then he would later go on and be like the president of the DFB, etc. And he would be one of the masterminds behind Stuttgart's first 2 Bundesliga titles, as well as their return to the top flight. So in 1977, the team would return to the Bundesliga, winning the Zweite Bundesliga Süd with an attack that included Ottmar Hitzfeld and Dieter Hoeneß. This was a team that was known for their attacking football, and during their promotion season, they would actually score over 100 goals. Upon their return to the top flight, Stuttgart would automatically be competing at the top of the table, over the next 6 seasons, they would only drop out of the top 4 once. Even in 1980, they would reach the semi-finals of the UEFA Cup, but would lose to fellow Bundesliga side Borussia Mönchengladbach, who would then go on to lose to fellow Bundesliga side Eintracht Frankfurt in the final. Then, in 1983-84, with a relatively young team for the time, which included a name such as Guido Buchwald, Stuttgart found themselves in a title race with defending champions Hamburg, Borussia Mönchengladbach and Bayern Munich. So the defending champion and the 2 most dominant teams over the previous decade. And despite the 4-horse race, Stuttgart were the team that spent the longest at the top of the table. Then heading into the penultimate match day of the season, Hamburg would lose to Frankfurt while Stuttgart would beat Werder Bremen. So this meant Stuttgart would return to the top of the table. And so despite the teams playing one another on the final day, Hamburg would need a big win to overtake the league leaders. So this meant Stuttgart won their first ever Bundesliga title on goal difference, while 1 point separated the top 4. And this would be Stuttgart's first major title in 26 years and first league title in over 30. And then over the next 7 seasons, Stuttgart would fall off a bit and would drift around mid-table once again. And then kind of out of nowhere, they again challenged for the Bundesliga title. So this time they were led by head coach Christoph Daum, who had made his name at Cologne, where he had taken Cologne to within touching distance of the Bundesliga title, where they ultimately would lose to Bayern. And then they had players such as Guido Buchwald, Fritz Walter, not to be confused with the Fritz Walter of Kaiserslautern, as this Fritz Walter, was also a striker, but just shared the name. And they also had a sweeper by the name of Matthias Sammer, who they plucked from Dynamo Dresden, because at the end of the DDR, Dresden obviously changed. They went through changes like the other Bundesliga or East German clubs did, and it also now meant he could leave. Obviously, Sammer was set to join Leverkusen, but he would ultimately have his contract terminated because the German Chancellor comes in and says, "I don't want you to be, investing in just hoovering up players from East Germany to all these teams, especially Leverkusen, who had a history of doing that." And now with a slightly older side than 8 years ago, this would prove to be one of the more dramatic endings of the Bundesliga season. So for most of that season, it was mainly between Eintracht Frankfurt and Borussia Dortmund. Then kind of out of nowhere, Stuttgart appeared to create a 3-way title race. And so this meant on the heading into the final day of the season, Eintracht Frankfurt were first, Stuttgart was second, and Borussia Dortmund were third, all tied on 50 points. Frankfurt were to play relegated Hansa Rostock, Stuttgart would play Bayer Leverkusen, and Dortmund would play Duisburg. For Stuttgart, it started off in the worst possible way because they would concede a penalty in the 20th minute to go 1-0 down, and Matthias Sammer would be sent off. At the same time, Dortmund had scored in the 9th minute against Duisburg to be leading 1-0, and Frankfurt were drawing 0-0 with Hansa Rostock. So this meant Dortmund would win the title. Just before half-time, Fritz Walter would score a penalty, which would level it for Stuttgart. However, it would mean very little. As things stood, Dortmund would still be champions. And then if we jump to the 85th minute of all the games, because they all kicked off at the same time, Dortmund were the virtual champions. As Frankfurt were drawing 1-1 with Rostock, as were Stuttgart and Leverkusen. And Frankfurt were coming increasingly closer to scoring. Because obviously if Frankfurt won, they would win the title. As in, if all teams won their games, Frankfurt would still win the title. Then in the 86th minute, Guido Buchwald headed in a cross to make it 2-1 to Stuttgart. Then 3 minutes later, Frankfurt would then concede in the 89th minute, meaning Stuttgart had kind of out of nowhere won the Bundesliga.
Mal zum Ausgleich zu kommen. Was ist passiert?
Leverkusen! Der VfB Stuttgart führt mit 2-1. Ich kann's nicht fassen. Der VfB Stuttgart hat den zweiten Treffer erzielt, an den hier niemand mehr geglaubt hat. Christoph Daum hat ausgewechselt, hat 2 neue Stürmer gebracht, nämlich Sverrisson und Kastel. Gaudino und Walter sitzen auf der Bank, und wer schießt das Tor? Der Kapitän Guido Buchwald.
Erst einmal zu Fall gebracht, aber fällt fast selbst, und dann können die Rostocker sich frei machen, und dann spielt erst einmal Bindewald gegen die Rostocker, und jetzt fällt das Tor für Rostock gleich, denn da ist der Böger ganz allein durch und macht das 2-1 für Hansa Rostock. Alles ist entschieden hier in Rostock. Die Frankfurter können nicht mehr Meister werden.
And surprised plenty of people. And so Stuttgart were the champions of the first ever full Bundesliga, including teams from East Germany, after reunification. Again, after kind of showing how surprising this is, Stuttgart struggled again, but they did win the DFB-Pokal in 1997, thanks to a front three known as the Magic Dreiecke, which included Giovanni Elber, Freddy Bobic, and Krasimir Balakov. And who were they coached by? Joachim Löw. But then this would collapse pretty quickly. They weren't really able to establish any sort of major success because they were picked off very quickly. Elber moved to Bayern and Bobic moved to Dortmund. And then in 2000, Meyer Vorfelder would leave the club in a difficult financial situation. And what they had to do then was they had to begin relying on younger players to help them. For example, promoted goalkeeper Timo Hildebrand, as well as striker Kevin Kuriani, who, interesting background, was born in Brazil, could have also played for Panama or Hungary as well as Germany. His initial football education was in Brazil before he moved to Stuttgart, and then he was promoted to the first team. And this is the idea of, they were called the Jungen Walden, the young ones. And quite surprisingly, under Felix Magath, they would actually finish an unlikely second. But 4 years later, this team would go one step further. With the inclusion of the likes of Hildebrand as the goalkeeper, Kuriani had left, but they had promoted striker Mario Gomez and midfielder Sami Khedira, as well as having the experience of Marcus Babbel and Thomas Hitzelsberger. And under head coach Armin Veh, they surprised plenty of people. And so for much of the season, like basically every other time they won the title, they flew under the radar for much of the campaign. As at this point, it was expected to be fought between Bayern, Schalke and Werder Bremen. And so Stuttgart regularly hung around the top four, spending only one match day of the season at the top, which was on match day 12. Until match day 33, they were, out of nowhere, climbed to the top of the table after a 3-2 win against Bochum, where they had to fight back from being 2-1 down, while Schalke lost 2-0 to rivals Borussia Dortmund. And then on the final day of the season, a header from Sami Khedira would secure a 2-1 win against Energy Cottbus and ultimately the title. However, they had the chance to actually win the double this season, and they were in the DFB-Pokal final against Nuremberg, but would lose 3-2 in Berlin. And after the win, in 2007, it basically saw a gradual decline. Obviously, Stuttgart tried to build on this success. They spent big on players, but then they also would lose the likes of Mario Gomez, who moved to Bayern, and they replaced him with Pavel Pogrebniak, who wasn't as good. They brought back Alexander Hleb. Hleb was actually a previous academy player at Stuttgart, but he would only join on loan. Sami Khedira would move to Real Madrid. Hildebrand left and moved to Valencia right after the title win, and obviously losing the likes of those players then created kind of a void, and it resulted in a gradual decline and slip down the table before they were relegated in 2006. And then they would really become a bit like a yo-yo team, as they would return to the top flight immediately, but then would be relegated again in 2019 after losing the relegation playoff to Union Berlin. And then with the help of the goals of returning Mario Gomez, as well as Sasa Kalajic, Nico Gonzalez, Silas, and other notable names, they would return to the Bundesliga. And then in their first season, they would finish 9th. It's quite commendable for obviously a newly promoted side. But the second season was not as easy. And under head coach Pellegrino Matarazzo, who had led them to promotion, they would flirt with relegation for much of the season, and it would reach another dramatic final day climax. So, heading into the final day, Stuttgart would play Cologne, and they were 16th and needed to win and hoped Hertha Berlin would lose so they could leapfrog them and get out of the relegation playoff. Hertha were playing Borussia Dortmund and would lose that game 2-1. However, Stuttgart needed to win, and as the game approached its end, they were drawing 1-1 with Cologne. And so then you're thinking, okay, they're going to have to play in the relegation playoff. Granted, it wasn't known yet who they would play against. And then with one of the last kicks of the game, and what's been one of the more dramatic endings to a Bundesliga season, a corner is played in the 92nd minute. A corner is played in, and captain, and one of the smallest players on the pitch, Wataru Endo, heads it in to save Stuttgart from relegation, or from heading into the relegation playoff. And so in the dying moments, Hertha Berlin would drop in and they would play Hamburg. However, the next season, Matarazzo would be sacked and Stuttgart would quite costly replace him with Bruno Labbadia, which meant they flirted further with relegation, and relegation looked more certain. Because he was that crap, he sent them deeper into the relegation battle. However, some transformative appointments were made. Fabian Wohlgemuth was made sporting director, and he helped with the hiring of Sebastian Hoeneß. And the hiring of Sebastian Hoeneß would be a turning point for Stuttgart, as Hoeneß was out of a job after he was sacked by Hoffenheim the summer beforehand. He would turn the season around, but ultimately they would come up just short of actual safety, and they would end up playing in the relegation playoff, but they would comfortably beat Hamburg. The next season would be their best since their title win. While Bayer Leverkusen obviously stole the headlines in 23-24 as they won their first ever title unbeaten, Stuttgart would actually end up finishing second, thanks to the goals of Cyril Guirassy and Dennis Undav, as well as the likes of obviously Waldemar Anton, Angelo Stiller, Chris Führich, Enzo Mio, Hiroki Ito. The list goes on and on. And this included a big win against Bayern in the run-in, which eventually allowed them to leapfrog them in the penultimate match day after Bayern lost to Hoffenheim. And then they returned to the Champions League, where granted they did underperform, but and they underperformed in the league last season too, but they would win the DFB Pokal last season in 24-25, with a win against Arminia Bielefeld in the final. And this was their first time they won the trophy in nearly 28 years. Obviously, the last time they won it was in 97. Now, under Sebastian Hoeneß, Stuttgart are on the ascendancy once again. And as long as Hoeneß stays in charge, obviously, I would say the sky's the limit for Stuttgart. They now have one of the youngest teams in the league, but they have plenty of more senior players who are standouts in the likes of Dennis Undav, Ömertin Demirovic, and Maximilian Mittelstadt, Jeff Chabot. Now they have the potential to do what they've done previously and just surprise everyone and win the title at some point. I think they have the quality to do such a thing. But the key, obviously, is for Hoeneß to be, as long as Hoeneß is there, anything is possible. It also helps if they keep Angelo Stiller. However, as time goes on, maybe that's not as certain for them to do such a thing. Obviously, right now they're fourth in the league, while they're in the semi-finals of the DFB Pokal and could potentially go back to back in that. And they do have their backs against the wall against Porto in the Europa League. But if they overcome Porto, then I do think Stuttgart have the chance to also win the Europa League this season, because on the day they're very good. And then even as the likes of Fabian Vogelmuth says, their goal is to win the title, and as long as Hoeneß is in charge and shares the vision, it is possible. I strongly believe it's entirely possible that Stuttgart could win the league. With the way they play, the person in charge, the way the club's run now, it's all set up that they will be able to do that. And then the fact they have a young team who's obviously still developing at times, as long as they don't succumb to these players being sold, like the likes of Nick Woltemade, who was there for only a year, but they're able to do this, then I think it's possible. But obviously, it also depends what happens with Bayern, because as long as Vincent Kompany's in charge, they look kind of unstoppable. However, all you need is that one moment, and if you have that one, like lightning in a bottle, basically, which is what Leverkusen had, all you need is that, and that one season, and it changes everything. With Sebastian Hoeneß in Stuttgart, I believe that's possible, and I think it's entirely possible that it happens in the next 5 years too. But let me know what you think about Stuttgart, whether you think they can win the league eventually, or if there are any moments that I missed going over their previous Bundesliga wins, just let me know.